For the second straight year, there is no SEC team in the national championship game.
Oh my God!
This is after 8 of the first 9 CFP national championships feature at least one SEC team, and in 6 of those games, the SEC came out on top. With this being the 11th year of the college football playoff, the SEC has won over 50% of all CFP championships. So what should we make of the last 2 years? Is it a blip on the radar or a sign of things to come? I originally talked about the state of the SEC back in November, so this is kind of like an end of season follow-up to that video. And in that video, we talked a lot about the downfall of the Alabama football dynasty. And personally, I don't think that the importance of Nick Saban and the Alabama Crimson Tide to the SEC can be overstated. So to continue on that point, let's look at how bad the SEC failed in the CFP this year. The 3 teams that made the tournament, Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee, went 2-3 with a negative 30-point differential over 5 games. The 2 wins that they did have came against the 2 lowest ranked teams in all the college football playoff that had to use their conference championship to even qualify for the tournament. On the other hand, the 3 losses that they had came against the 2 teams that are going to be participating in the national championship on Monday the 20th. 2 against Ohio State and the other one against Notre Dame. And each of those wins and losses has explanations for what happened within the plays of the game. But we don't talk about that here. In any case, college football has a way of taking an entire season and boiling it down to the last 60 minutes that you play. Don't I know it?
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
But with all that, what does this mean for the SEC? A couple months ago, we had Lane Kiffin saying this.
You might as well be in different leagues, not conferences, different leagues. You know, like here's the NFL, here's the SEC, here's those few Big Ten teams, and then here's everybody else.
And right before Conference Championship Week, we had the SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey letting us all know that the SEC strength of schedule is a league above everyone else in the country. And watching my videos puts you in a whole different league. So make sure you like and subscribe. And we're about to be monetized, so keep on watching, boys. But then, his conference went 1-6 against the Big Ten and Notre Dame during bowl season. And of the 3 SEC teams that were supposed to be in the CFP, according to all SEC fans, only Ole Miss won their bowl game. And they beat Duke, who finished 7th in the ACC. Over the full season, the SEC went 4-8 against the Big Ten and Notre Dame, and 3-9 against the spread in those games. Meanwhile, they went 16-5 against the other Power 4 conferences, so one down year against a strong conference is not a cause for panic. After all, there has been massive changes due to conference realignment, and although Oklahoma is in a bit of a downswing, the SEC did add 2 blue bloods to an already stacked conference lineup. And with the addition of Texas and Oklahoma, current SEC teams have won 17 of the 27 national championships since the start of the BCS in '98. And that includes 8 different schools from that conference that have won those games. The ACC has 5 of the other championships, and Ohio State is playing for the Big Ten's 5th on Monday night. The power of that kind of generational dominance doesn't go away in 2 years. And for all the talk about how NIL is going to level the playing field and everyone's going to pay players, which the SEC was definitely paying players before, at least 12 SEC teams have been in the top 25 recruiting ranks every year since 2002, which is the first recruiting class since NIL was legalized. So maybe the reports of the SEC's demise have been overstated. But something has changed. After all, 2004-2005 was the last time the SEC went 2 years without having at least one team in the national championship. So to figure out what's changed, I want to go back to Alabama. In the last video, we talked about their dominance over college football as a whole, but I want to kind of zero in on how much they dominated the SEC specifically. In Nick Saban's 17 years as head man of the Crimson Tide, there were only 5 years where they didn't play in either the SEC championship and or the national championship. Of those 5 years, they were SEC Western Division co-champions 3 times. They finished in the AP top 10 4 times, and the only other year that doesn't fall in those 2 first categories was Saban's first year in Tuscaloosa. Actually, between Alabama's first appearance in the national championship, which was a BCS national championship in 2009, and their most recent one, which is a CFP national championship in 2021, there was never a span of 3 years when they didn't play in at least one national championship. I say again, the importance of Alabama and Nick Saban to the SEC cannot be overstated. The conference could always count on having a top 5 team that will be a part of the biggest games of the season on the biggest networks. That gives the other teams in the conference a strong recruiting tool to say, you could come here and knock off Alabama in front of the entire country in a primetime game. Having that one solid team makes it so there's always an arms race to beat Alabama. Not only does it help in recruiting, but in terms of strength of schedule, always having a top 5 team on all of the conference schedules, everybody who plays Alabama is always going to have a top 5 team. The strength of schedule has ripple effects from having that one tentpole top 5 team that you can always count on. And the jury's still out on Kalen DeBoer, but there is no way he could ever have the success and consistency that Nick Saban had during his time in Tuscaloosa. His first season at the helm has fallen into the worst season Nick Saban had besides his first season, and he is still pulling on Saban's coattail. So without Alabama, there's no way the SEC could have that generational dominance that they had over college football over the last decade and a half plus. But really, there's no way that any conference could have that kind of dominance anymore in college football. So while the SEC is definitely falling down, I don't see another conference that's going to automatically take their place. Instead, what I think we're seeing is a sea change in college football as a whole. With the death of the Pac-12, RIP, and the results of the roaches scattering into the different conferences, we've been served up by the powers that be a Power 4 conference slate. But really what we have is a Power 2. I mean, look, even with the concessions made to conference champions getting an automatic qualifier this year, the SEC and the Big Ten accounted for 7 of the 12 CFP teams this year. And the only team outside of those 2 conferences that won a playoff game is Notre Dame. And really, Notre Dame should join the Big Ten, but that's something we'll talk about in a future video. If we're just looking at results, the SEC and the Big Ten combined for a 24-11 record against the other Power 4 conferences this year. And this part's objective, but tell me this. How far down the list of top college football programs do you have to go to find a team outside of the Power 2 or Notre Dame? Is it 10 spots? 15? 20? 25? And who is it that you have that breaks up the power clump at the top? And remind you, we're talking program, not team. So there needs to be a little bit of consistency in their winning and their recruiting and all that goes into a college football program. So we're probably looking at Clemson, but they've definitely fallen off in the past couple years. So maybe it's Miami or maybe it's Boise State. But other than that, name me a program that has been consistently good at the national level. And listening to myself, I feel a little bit like a guy that got rich and started talking shit about all the poor people, which when I do get rich, I will be talking shit about the poor people. So stay tuned for that.
You're broke! You're fucking poor!
But I've been a Pac-12 fan for all these years, and I've thought that the Big Ten and the SEC have been overrated. But with all the changes that have happened over the last couple of years, the cream has been scooped off the top and put into those 2 conferences. And while there's still good teams in the Big 12 and the ACC and the Group of 5, they're not consistent like these top teams are. They just don't have the resources to be. So we have to look at the realities. And the stakes of this revelation probably mean more in the long term. But like I talked about in my video about Notre Dame, which I'll agree, there's some parts in there that aren't aging super well. But what I did say is we have 1 year left on this CFP contract. So the College Football Playoff Committee needs to swing for the fences and get it right for the 2025-2026 season. Otherwise, after 2026, we're going to be watching something completely different. Here's my suggestion on how to make the 2025-2026 college football playoff the best version of a 12-team FBS playoff that you can get. First, we need to take the number of guaranteed spots from 5 down to 4. And it's not just based on the fact that no conference champions won a game this year. But as Greg Sankey said, this playoff was conceived prior to the recent conference realignment that we saw in college football. So that means 2 things. Originally, they were assuming that there would be 6 guaranteed spots with the Pac-12 conference champion in the mix. And secondly, those guaranteed spots will be spread amongst teams that are now in the same conference fighting for the same automatic qualifier. Teams like Oregon, Washington, Texas, Oklahoma, and I guess USC in some miracle scenario, and we're not even going to mention UCLA or the other Pac-12 teams, are now battling for those spots against national powers in their same conference. At the same time, teams like Arizona State and Clemson are playing far inferior competition, yet they have the same reward for winning clearly weaker conferences. So let's see, who are the teams that would get these 4 guaranteed spots? The idea that the conference championship participants from the Power 2 will get all the guaranteed spots it does have some merit, but I find it hard to believe that the teams that would be participating in the conference championship for those Power 2 conferences would not be in the top 12 anytime soon. So it doesn't seem important. In addition, I think that the other conferences do deserve a spot in the playoff, and their participation makes it a true FBS playoff as opposed to just a Power 2 playoff, which we might get in 2026 anyway. Based on this year's results, only one conference champion needed to use their guaranteed spot in order to get into the playoff, while the other four would have gotten an at-large bid with just their ranking. For me, if the goal is to have the best teams playing in the playoff, then getting as close to what the committee deems as the top 12 teams through their rankings, being the 12 teams that are actually in the playoff, is the way to do that. So the 4 guaranteed spots should go to the Power 2 conference champions. I think that those conferences have proved winning that conference means you should have a spot in the playoff. I don't think that there's going to be any time where a conference champion in the Big Ten or a conference champion in the SEC is not going to be in the top 12, but they should still get that guaranteed spot no matter what. And then the other 2 spots should go to the 2 highest ranked conference champions of all the other conferences. It might seem unfair, but even this year, if Clemson didn't get the guaranteed spot because of their conference championship, all 4 Power 4 conferences would have been represented with SMU getting an at-large bid, and the group of 5 or 6 still would have been represented with Boise State getting a guaranteed spot, but they didn't need it because of their at-large bid. Now, for those ACC fans and Big 12 fans that are going to gripe about not being considered a Power 4 conference, when you win 11 of 45 games, your 2 conferences win 11 of 45 games against the bigger 2 conferences, you are more like the group of 5 or 6, depending on where you put the Pac-12, than you are like the Power 2 in the Big Ten and the SEC. Guaranteeing a spot in the playoff for teams that won a conference but are not in the top 12 is just like raising your hand and saying our rankings are wrong. In a lot of cases, they probably are wrong when it gets to the end of the playoff, the 11, 12, 13. But we'll talk about that later on this year. My second change goes along with moving away from blindly rewarding conference champions of historically good conferences. It is no more rewarding conference champions with the top 4 seeds. No reseeding whatsoever. It's crazy how much the reseeding changed the playoffs just this year in the first year that they did it. If you really look at what happened due to this reseeding, the semifinals that we got should have been quarterfinals matchups based on the rankings that the College Football Playoff Committee put in. Texas and Ohio State should have been a 3-6 matchup in the quarterfinals, and Penn State, Notre Dame should have been a 4-5 matchup in the quarterfinals. As a Duck fan, I can't help but be bitter about that. Truly, all of the fan bases of the playoff teams outside of the semifinalists should have been bitter about the reseeding. Even Boise State was given a tougher matchup in the first game than it would have been without the reseeding. And yes, they get a bye, so technically they were already where they would have been if they won their first game. But college football fans want to watch their teams win. College football teams want to win, and they would have felt much better about playing at Indiana in the first round than having to just wait for Penn State in the Fiesta Bowl. After a month-long break, mind you. The only place that the reseeding made any sense was at the negotiating table. Otherwise, there is no discernible way that you could see that this improved the competition in any way. It gave outsized advantages to teams that had a chance to earn the advantage but didn't in Texas and Penn State. And then it gave disadvantages to the teams that went out and earned advantages in Oregon and Georgia. I know I'm beating a dead horse. I've been saying this for 2 months before the playoffs even started. But the Big Ten and the SEC need to demand change on this specific reseeding topic because it both hurt and benefited them this year. Where Oregon and Georgia were hurt, Texas and Penn State were benefited, but it's not always going to work out with such balance. And what's to stop teams in the future from throwing championship games in order to get a better path come playoff time? If the Ducks would have lost, they would have got the 5th seed, played Clemson and Arizona State, but they went out and won to guarantee the number 1 seed. And look what it got them. It got them a first-round match or their first game matchup against the team that's probably going to win the national championship. And I know coaches get a bonus for winning conference champions, but I bet every coach in the country has a bigger bonus for winning playoff games. So that's what they're going to go towards. That brings me to the third change that needs to be made in light of the results of this year's playoff. And that's that the second round games need to be home games. The top 4 seeds have to be rewarded with home games. It's obvious. Again, the only place that it made sense for the worst teams to get home games when the better teams had to play in the bowl games is at the negotiating table. The New Year's Six Bowls, the Rose Bowl, Fiesta Bowl, Cotton Bowl, all these motherfuckers, Orange Bowl, they demanded that they have the best games. Therefore, they have the second round games, which should be, in essence, top 8 matchups. And acquiescing to those demands hurt the competition in the long run. And if you're the Power 2, you lost out on home games because of that setup. With my plan, Oregon, Georgia, Penn State, and Texas all host a home game in the second round. Ideally, and I think what's best, is that the first 2 rounds are all home games because neutral field games are super gay and they take away a lot of the energy that makes college football magical. But I'm sure that it would never make it out of any negotiation to take out the bowls completely. So playing the first round games at bowl games and then second round games as home games is a fine trade-off for the 2025-2026 season. But after that, the new CFP should look more and more like what the NFL playoff does, with all games prior to the national championship being played as home games at the higher seed stadium. So to answer the title of the video, this was one of the worst seasons for the SEC since the mid-2000s, and that big part of that has to do with the failure in the college football playoffs. But the season is not without silver linings. See, because in the midst of all this massive change that we're seeing across the sport, the SEC could spend its time fighting the narrative that it's fading relative to its success over the past nearly 2 decades. Or it could recognize that there's opportunity to wield more power than it's ever had. A Big Ten SEC alliance could spell doom for those good old day loyalists out there that want the college football that they grew up with. But if you still think there's a chance to put the genie back in the bottle, then you need to wake up and smell the roses. You are never going to see that again. What you need to do is root for your school to find a strong position in the new age of college football and let go of the past because it's never coming back. Thanks for watching that video. If you've made it this far, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. If you'd like to watch more of my videos, I've got my one over here about Notre Dame, which I talked about not aging super well, but go ahead and check it out because it's got a lot of the ideas that I talked about here. And the first part of this video is up here. It's the SEC and the conference realignment, which you can check out there. Other than that, you can go ahead and subscribe here, and we'll catch you next time. See ya!